Ever wondered why World War I was called the Great War? Well, it wasn't because it was a grand party, that's for sure. We're not talking about a grandiose celebration, folks. Quite the contrary. The term great here, ironically, represents scale and not splendor. The Great War, as it was known, was a colossal global conflict that truly changed the course of history. A war so great in its devastation, it left an indelible mark on our collective consciousness. Now, before you start picturing a vintage version of an Avengers movie, let's clarify something. This was no heroic quest. It was a gritty, grim, and gruesome affair, filled with tales of bravery, yes, but also of unspeakable horror. And yet it's a story worth telling. A story of a world at war, of humanity pushed to its limits, and of the lessons we learned, sometimes the hard way. So buckle up, history enthusiasts. We're about to dive headfirst into the muddy trenches of the First World War. So, Europe in the early 20th century was a bit like a high school cafeteria. Everyone had their cliques and alliances, and everyone was just waiting for a food fight to break out. Now imagine if this cafeteria was filled with a bunch of over-caffeinated teenagers, each one thinking they're the hottest thing since sliced bread. That's pretty much what Europe was like. You had the cool kids, like Britain and France, who were pretty chummy and liked to swap lunch items. Then you had Germany, the new kid on the block, desperately trying to sit at the cool table by building up a massive navy. But Britain, with its rule Britannia attitude, wasn't keen on sharing its naval supremacy. They were like, no way Germany, this is our table, go build your own. And so, the naval arms race began. Meanwhile, you had Austria-Hungary and Russia squabbling over the Balkans like two siblings fighting over the last piece of cake. The Balkans was this scrappy, independent kid that nobody really understood but everybody wanted a piece of. You see, the Balkans was a mix of different ethnic groups, each with their own dreams and aspirations, just like a typical teenage drama. And then there was Italy, the unpredictable one, who would switch sides faster than you could say pizza. One minute they were with Germany and Austria-Hungary in the Triple Alliance, the next they were with Britain, France and Russia in the Triple Entente. Talk about playing both sides. And let's not forget about the Ottoman Empire, the old-school bully who was losing its grip. They were like the big kid who used to be really tough but was now losing his muscles and desperately trying to hang on to his reputation. All these tensions were simmering, just waiting for the right spark to set them off. It was like the cafeteria was filled with powder kegs, all ready to explode. And then, like a cherry bomb in a cream pie, Archduke Franz Ferdinand was assassinated and the food fight began. Now imagine if that food fight turned into a full-blown brawl, and the school janitor had to step in to break it up. That's pretty much what happened when World War I started. So it's the summer of 1914, and Europe is like a schoolyard full of rival cliques. The popular kids, France and Britain, have formed an alliance. The new kid, Germany, is trying to make a name for himself, and everyone is eyeing the quiet kid in the corner, Russia, wondering what he's going to do. Suddenly the schoolyard bully, Austria-Hungary, throws a punch at the little guy, Serbia. But Serbia has friends. Russia steps in, and Germany, who's got Austria-Hungary's back, jumps into the fray. It's a full-blown melee in no time at all. Meanwhile, Britain and France are standing on the sidelines shaking their heads. They really didn't want to get involved, but when Germany decides to march through Belgium, the equivalent of knocking over someone's lunch tray, they can't ignore it any longer. Now, picture Italy as the kid who can't decide which side to join. Initially, they were part of the Central Powers with Germany and Austria-Hungary. But when they saw the Allies' lunch money, they switched sides faster than you can say spaghetti. On the other side of the pond, the United States is like the school janitor. They're just trying to keep the halls clean and stay out of the drama. But when Germany starts messing with their supplies, the equivalent of dumping trash in the janitor's closet, Uncle Sam rolls up his sleeves and says, "All right, that's it, you're all going to detention." And just like that, the schoolyard brawl was now a global conflict. Talk about escalation. Ever had a bad day and just wanted to dig a hole and hide? Well, that's what the soldiers did. Except their holes were filled with mud, rats, and the occasional artillery shell. Imagine having your worst day ever and then multiply that by 1,000. That's the daily life of a soldier in the trenches during World War I. These trenches were not the cozy hobbit holes of Middle-earth, oh no. They were muddy, rat-infested, and the constant background noise was not the chirping of birds but the whistling of incoming artillery shells. Now let's talk about the food. Imagine dining at the worst restaurant you've ever been to. Got the image? Great. Now picture the food being worse. That's what these soldiers had to eat. Their daily menu was primarily bully beef, hardtack, and a watery soup. Bon appetit! And let's not forget about the smell. There was no Febreze back then, folks. The stench of unwashed bodies, overflowing latrines, and decaying matter was a constant companion. In fact, it could get so bad that soldiers would smoke cigarettes not for the nicotine but to mask the smell. But it wasn't all doom and gloom. Soldiers found ways to keep their spirits up. They'd play cards, write letters, and even put on plays. They'd make jokes about the rats, compete over who had the worst food, and even find humor in the constant danger they were in. After all, laughter is the best medicine, right? Of course, these were just momentary distractions from the grim reality of trench warfare. The conditions were horrific, the danger was constant, and the death toll was staggering. But the human spirit is resilient. These soldiers kept going, day after day, in the face of unimaginable hardships. So, next time you're having a bad day, just remember, at least you're not stuck in a muddy hole being shelled by the enemy. Finally, after 4 years of fighting, the school bell rang and everyone had to go back to class. Or in this case, the armistice was signed and the fighting stopped. Imagine the relief, the sighs of tired soldiers like students who had been in a never-ending math class. The 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month of 1918 marked the end of this global conflict. It was as if the principal had finally walked into the room and said, "Enough." But the end of the war didn't mean everyone got to pack up and go home. No, it was more like the end of a school year, where you still have to tidy up your locker, return your textbooks, and say your goodbyes. The cleanup was a monumental task. Nations had to figure out what to do with all the leftover artillery, like kids trying to decide who gets to keep the leftover pizza from lunch. And then came the reparations, akin to the school bullies having to make amends. Germany, the naughty kid in this scenario, was asked to cough up a whopping 132 billion gold marks. That's like asking a kid to give up his lunch money, school supplies, and even his favorite toy car. And just like that kid, Germany wasn't too happy about it. The Treaty of Versailles, signed in June of 1919, was the report card everyone had been waiting for. But instead of grades, it contained the terms of peace and the consequences for the Central Powers. It was like the strictest parent-teacher meeting ever, where the Allies played the role of the stern teachers and the Central Powers, the students who had to face the music. And just like that, the biggest food fight in history was over, but the cafeteria would never be the same again. Now, after a big fight, there's always a lot of cleaning up to do, and after World War I, the cleanup was a doozy. Imagine that you just hosted the most epic, out-of-control house party. Your living room is a wreck, there's a mysterious stain on the carpet, and someone's left a horse in the bathroom. That's a bit like what the aftermath of World War I looked like. Only instead of a house, it was the whole world. And instead of a horse, it was a range of complex political and economic issues. The Treaty of Versailles was like the world's attempt at a morning-after cleanup crew. It was signed in 1919, and it's what officially ended the state of war between Germany and the Allied powers. But like trying to clean up that party with a single dustpan and brush, it had its fair share of problems. Germany, for instance, felt like the guy who got blamed for the mess because he threw the last punch, even though the fight started hours before he showed up. The treaty forced Germany to accept full responsibility for the war, to disarm, make substantial territorial concessions, and pay reparations to certain countries. It was like Germany was told to replace the entire carpet, repaint the walls, and buy a new horse for the bathroom, all with his own money. And then there were the map redrawings. If the world was a puzzle before the war, afterward, it was like someone had taken that puzzle, thrown it in the air, and then tried to put it back together while riding a roller coaster. New countries popped up, others disappeared, and some changed shape or location. It was a geographical game of musical chairs, and not everyone was happy with where they ended up sitting. But it wasn't all bad. The war also led to some positive changes like advancements in technology and medicine, and a push towards women's suffrage. It was like finding out that your party had been so wild it made the local news and now everyone thinks you're a legend. So there you have it, the Great War in a nutshell. It may have been a messy food fight, but it sure changed the world in a big way. So the next time someone asks you about World War I, just tell them it was like a giant food fight that got way out of hand. When you think back on this video, remember our quirky analogy of World War I being a colossal food fight that spiraled into a global conflict. We started with the powder keg, that tense dinner party where everyone was eyeing each other's dishes with jealousy and suspicion, ready to fling the first meatball. That's the complex web of alliances and rivalries that set the stage for the war. Then the war kicks off where the first meatball was flung, or in our real-world scenario, the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand. This act was like the first splash of gravy, setting off a cascade of reactions that led to the start of the war. The trench warfare, where the food fight got really messy and everyone dug in deep, flinging everything they had at each other across a no-man's land of mashed potatoes and gravy. This was the grueling, grim reality of the war, where progress was slow and the cost in lives was high. Fast forward to the end of the war, when the last meatball was thrown and everyone was exhausted, covered in food and ready for it to be over. That's the armistice, the agreement that finally brought an end to the fighting. And then, the aftermath, where everyone had to clean up the mess, deal with the consequences of the food fight, and pay the tab. This was the Treaty of Versailles and the significant political changes that reshaped the world. So, there you have it, a food fight analogy to help you remember the main points about World War I. It's funny, but it's also a bit sobering when you consider the real human cost of this food fight. Thanks for joining us on this historical journey. Remember, history isn't just about dates and facts, it's about understanding the big food fights of the past so we can avoid them in the future.